Hello, everyone. We're just going to go ahead and start because our schedule is so tight. My name is Tal Zarsky. I'm a professor at the University of Haifa. I've been working for over a decade on ICT-related legal and policy issues, and most recently I've been dealing with cybersecurity issues as well. And the University of Haifa is honored to sponsor and organize this panel as part of CPDP. I'll provide a few quick words about the topic, the link to the conference, and the speakers themselves. So the topic is the issue of protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. And not only is it of vast importance, given recent attacks and the vulnerabilities they expose that we'll hear about now, and also it is a very relevant issue because of recent regulatory changes and discussions. But as an academic, I think it presents very interesting analytical and academic riddles. What form of regulation is optimal? Direct, co-regulation, self-regulation, we'll hear all about that now. Ex ante or ex post, after the fact. Where lie the best forms of knowledge and expertise with private entities or with the government and which part of a government? And how important are transparency and accountability in the specific context and how they could be achieved? Now, this topic is not a natural link to CPDP, which mostly deals with privacy and data protection, and I thank the organizers for allowing its introduction and inclusion. So, as I said, CPDP only incidentally deals with cybersecurity themes, but I think they're critical for our discussion here today, and for three quick reasons I will note now. First of all, the title of our conference, CPDP, this year includes the word infrastructure, so it's only fair we have some discussion of infrastructure. Second, data security issues often are discussed as part of privacy discussions. They're part of a regulation and a directive, and therefore should be brought into the discourse. And thirdly, and on a substantial level, the discussion we'll talk about today and launch today entails the same set of analytical tools used in other parts of the discussions here within the conference. We talk about technology, understanding it by lawyers and regulators, the role and limits of government, and the importance and risks of information systems. Now, we'll quickly move to our speakers, and I will address and introduce them now so we could move on with our discussion. In their order of speaking, Bibi von der Berg is an associate professor at Leiden University. She works at ELAW and at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs, where she runs the cybersecurity group, and she is a member of a Dutch cybersecurity council where she advises the Dutch cabinet on how to improve cybersecurity. Michel van Leeuwen, almost got it, leads the cybersecurity policy department within the Ministry of Security and Justice in the Netherlands. Amit Ashkenazi is the legal advisor for the Israeli National Cyber Bureau and is charged of developing its domestic and international legal policy. And beforehand, he was head of legal department at the Israeli DPA. Bryan Cunningham is a cybersecurity and data protection and privacy lawyer and consultant. He previously served in senior intelligence and law enforcement positions in the U.S. government, most recently serving as a legal advisor to the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Now I'll turn the panel over to our moderator, Isabel Skierka, who is a research associate at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and welcome to this panel on critical infrastructure protection here. I'm very happy to see that so many people are interested in this topic. And as Tal just mentioned, we will go through presentations of our panelists. We'll start with Bibi, who will give an overview of our European critical infrastructure protection, and then move on. And in the end, I will give a very brief overview of the German IT security law, where I'm from, and then pose a couple of questions before opening up the panel to the audience. So, Bibi, the floor is yours.
I'm assuming all of the microphones work. Do they? Loud enough? Good. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, Tal, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel. It's also a bit of a challenge. Like Tal already mentioned, cybersecurity is not a natural theme within the CPDP conferences. And that's also when we were designing this, the program for this panel, we decided to start at the beginning, which is basically to explain what critical infrastructures even are and why there are issues in relation to cybersecurity there. And that task fell to me. I'll try to talk as brief as possible, but this is always very difficult for me. So if I go over my time, please somebody yank out the cable and then I'll stop. Okay, so what are critical infrastructures? Well, starting at the beginning, I mean, making it really, really simple, you could say the definition of a critical infrastructure has something to do with systems or systems of systems or networks of systems. It has something to do with systems that provide services or products to societies, and we consider these services and systems to be critical in some way. Well, if you pull apart the definition like that, it doesn't really help, because it raises more questions than it answers. Questions then become, what is a system, what is a service, and most importantly, what is critical? When is a service ever critical? Well, if you look at the history of this concept, it's important to note that the definition of critical infrastructures, or that whole debate, is really recent. Actually, the concept of a critical infrastructure was coined by the Clinton administration in 1996. So this is a really recent topic. That doesn't mean that, for instance, the military has had a longer standing debate about infrastructures and protection of infrastructures, but defining them as critical is a relevantly novel move. And the one reason why infrastructures have become to be labeled as critical is because there was a changed understanding of the security threats that were posed to these kinds of infrastructures. So there is a gradual understanding that there are all sorts of system vulnerabilities in relation to certain infrastructures, and for this reason they need proper protection. So the idea here is that infrastructures somehow form the foundation of society, and if certain aspects of infrastructures fail, then that has severe economic consequences, it has severe financial or social consequences, it can lead to civil unrest, it can even lead to physical harm, to death, on a large scale. And this is problematic, and that's why there are discussions on how we should protect such infrastructures. Now, if you look at the way the EU defines critical infrastructures in the most recent Network and Information Security Directive, it reads, critical infrastructure means an asset or a system or part thereof located in member states, which is essential for the maintenance of vital societal functions, health, safety, security, economic or social well-being of people, and the disruption or destruction of which would have significant impact in a member state as a result of the failure to maintain those functions. So all of the things I basically said before summed up in one neat definition. However, what are critical infrastructures? Which infrastructures do we deem critical? Because on an abstract level, it's fair enough to say, okay, so this revolves around infrastructures that are somehow vital for the functioning of society, but then what are they? And when you look into the way different countries and different groups and different continents have defined sets or domains of infrastructures which they deem critical, really actually funny things pop up. So, for instance, here's a picture of the United States, where the Department of Homeland Security has defined 16 different sectors of critical infrastructures. Well, if you look at these, on the face of this, it seems really reasonable, right? The only one that's actually surprised me was this one. So, national monuments and icons. I mean, of course, harm to national monuments is serious, but does society fall over when, Anyway, that's another debate. But one of the issues here is that people have said, okay, so now you've basically defined any and all sectors in society as critical, so what are you going to protect first? And what is deemed most important here? Now, if you look at, this is an overview from how the Germans would define critical infrastructures. Seems pretty okay to me. A little bit of overlap with the US, but also some differences there. One of the interesting things here is media and culture. So a question then becomes, media is definitely relevant in case of disruption of critical infrastructures, but is media itself defined as a critical infrastructure or not? And what are your grounds for doing so? Here's an overview of the sectors defined in the Network and Information Security Directive in the EU, so from last year. The EU defines 5 sectors that are considered critical. Here the interesting thing is that food and water is missing. So we don't need food, we just need health and finance and banking to move along. Now, of course, the issue here is that this is minimum harmonization, so that means that countries can still do things on top of this, and this is just the basis that they need to organize. But still, it's interesting that food and water are not considered critical infrastructures in this directive. Then some consultancy agency, I added this for fun, because it's really bizarre. And these are people who are, this is a pretty serious consultancy agency actually advising the American government. They divided it in 2 categories, energy and communications, and then for some reason stuck government and healthcare under communications, because that's all the government and hospitals do, communicate. They stuck nuclear reactors under communications, because that's, of course, what nuclear reactors are for. And they stuck emergency services under energy, because it takes a lot of energy to supply emergency services. Oh, and then there are people who think, you know, of course, this should be the model for critical infrastructures. So, you know, what I'm trying to say is that it's not at all clear what is defined as a critical infrastructure. And of course, the biggest difficulty is that in today's world, everything's interconnected. So the biggest concern is actually cascading effects. So when one sector is attacked, things may start to cascade into other areas, and that means that maybe the whole sector approach is completely the wrong way of trying to understand critical infrastructures, because they're infrastructures, so they're connected to everything else. But that, on the other hand, doesn't help us further, because we still need to start somewhere in trying to design proper protections. Okay, now what are some of the issues that could arise? Might also be relevant to discuss. You can actually divide them in different categories. First, simple physical harms. Think of natural disasters. Think of human attacks, so disrupting a chemical plant or damaging an oil pipeline. Doesn't necessarily have to be done through IT. I'll get to that later, but you can also do so in the physical world. And then there's human error. Right? Things simply go wrong because people make stupid mistakes. So it's also important to note in this entire debate about critical infrastructures that there's a distinction between intentional harms and accidental harms. So stuff happens, and that's also something we need to make sure that systems have proper redundancy and resilience to minimize the harms that are done in this way. Okay, so physical harms are a first category. Second category are information harms, so-called cybersecurity risks. Again, those can be unintentional, so losing a USB drive with really essential information, accidentally passing on passwords, so on and so forth. But of course, there are a lot of cases where that is, in fact, intentional harm. And then you can think of, denial of service attacks against banks using botnets, for instance, or using malware, or using cyber espionage, or stealing information, going after other parties' intellectual property, stealing blueprints, stealing crown jewels, and so on and so forth. Then there are phishing and spear phishing attacks, and so on. The whole range of all the activities that we label as cybersecurity or cybercrime issues actually also applies to the realm of critical infrastructures. And there are different kinds of actors who play a role in there. Some of them nation states, gathering intelligence, some of them hacktivists, some of them, individuals with all sorts of motives, disgruntled employees, and so on and so forth. And then organized crime, and the whole range of agents and actors that is relevant for cybercrime generally also applies to to critical infrastructures. Now, finally, the real problem arises when you combine these two things. So you can use information and informational means to create physical harm in the real world. We call this cyber physical harms. Examples of that include, especially in relation to critical infrastructures, say hacking into a system to open a dam, to blow up a gas pipeline, using cyber to make ATMs spit out money if you hack a bank, or using cyber to alter the chemical process of water cleaning so that you can poison a population, or creating a blackout by knocking out elements of the smart grid, using cyber to divert airplanes or make them crash, so on and so forth. Now, of course, it's especially in this last category that regulatory questions arise, right? It's obvious if you look at those kinds of risks that you think, okay, we should do something in terms of regulation, but then all sorts of other questions arise. First and foremost, going back to what is a critical infrastructure anyway, and which ought to be the most primary targets that we seek to regulate. The second issue is that in light of the phase of deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s, many of these critical infrastructures are now privately owned and operated. So that means involving private parties in making sure that networks become secure. That's not necessarily an easy thing to do because security doesn't necessarily always sit easily with the interests of businesses. Right? Businesses' focus is on business continuity, and it isn't always their primary goal, and especially if it costs a lot of money and they have to cooperate with a lot of other parties, it doesn't always sit well with private parties. Finally, another issue is sharing information. If we ask businesses to share information about security incidents, these businesses have an understandable concern about what happens to that information, who gets access to that, can it come back to harm their brand, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the questions that arise in this area, and regulatory initiatives are underway in many countries around the globe to deal with this kind of stuff and to propose answers on how we could fix this. That's what will be discussed on the panel today, and this is where I leave off. Thank you.
Thank you, Bibi. Now we'll swiftly move on to Michel, who will talk a little bit more about the practical context in the Netherlands and how the Netherlands secure critical infrastructures.
So thank you very much. We try to get some pictures here, yeah. So today we're talking about, it works, yeah, cyberspace, and it's quite as complex as the image looks. It's about, today we have 5 billion connected devices in the world, and if that's not a problem, it will be in 2020 when we have 21 billion connected devices in the world. So it's an ever-growing and changing problem. So cybersecurity is about being hacked. But it's not only about hacking, because it's also about the impact it has on our personal lives. It's about people. So that's a kind of nice thing Bibi said on the NIS directive. It's actually about the impact on our lives. And that's when we get concerned as a government, obviously. What's going on in cyberspace? Well, we get a new form of conflict. We see sort of things like a cyber war emerging. We see states getting active in the form of state espionage. We see military activity in cyberspace coming, and we have economic espionage. So there's a lot to be done, and cybercrime is one of the things we see as well. We see criminals going after our money and trying not to go to our houses, but just doing it online. We make a yearly national threat assessment in the Netherlands. And in this latest threat assessment, which is of a couple of months ago, we see a number of threats and challenges emerge for our Dutch society, I think, which are a bit more applicable also to other countries. At the core, at the heart of the things we face in cybersecurity are the software vulnerabilities and hardware vulnerabilities. It is, at this point in time, impossible not to make one error in 1,000 lines of code in programming. So we will be facing insecure hardware and software in times to come. And we see a very persistent point of entry of cybercriminals and state actors. Every malicious actor on the internet is doing phishing, and phishing gets more difficult. We used to see the mails and delete them and not click on the links, but the links get more and more intelligent. So we all, I think, have a risk to click on it and then have some malicious action going on in our computers and in our systems. One of the things we see coming in through phishing is cryptoware. And well, maybe to ask, is there anyone in the audience who has had cryptoware, who has known someone who has had cryptoware? Bibi? 2. Very good. Well, obviously you all have paid because you want the data back, but the thing is, you mustn't pay. Criminals are very reliable in that sense. They actually give your data back when you pay. That's why the model works. But there's actually not a good solution to cryptoware, and that's why it is so difficult for governments and law enforcement agencies to have a good solution. Because the encryption is that good that you can crack it. So there's only one option you have when you have been hit by cryptoware. Actually, that's when you have made a backup yesterday. So what I'd like you to ask is to go home and all make a backup, because you don't want to be hit by cryptoware the next day. The other thing you can do is wait, because eventually there will be a decryption key, but that could take months. But please don't pay, because we can't, well, the criminals keep going when you pay, you know, so that's not good. The next threat or challenge we face is the fact that we have we're very enthusiastic about our devices. We love using ICT. We love using it in our personal lives. We love using it at the office and in our factories. And we all switch to ICT and abandon all the analog alternatives. So the redundancy in our systems is going down. When offices go on to use ICTs, they ditch the typewriters. And when you ditch the typewriters, there's no alternative left when you get hacked. So no redundancy actually is a problem. And then the last challenge is the geopolitical context we face. It used to be a small and happy internet where we have all the possibilities and we have all the ICTs, but actually it's also becoming a conflict area. States going at each other, actors going towards states. So it has been a factor of geopolitical interest, and that's what makes it more and more complex. So where the government used to be the good guys protecting you from all the hackers, the government has a two-face at this point in time. We protect you against hackers, but we hack ourselves as well in order to get your security going. So it's for a good cause, so to say, but that makes it quite challenging and difficult. Moving on, last slide. I'm good. Yeah, I'm good in my time. So, what do we need to do? First of all, for me, it's very important to stop cybercrime and have some good cybercrime legislation going. We have the Budapest Convention, and in the EU, we're building on that. And those are also topics we face in our current presidency, as the Netherlands is current president of the European Union. Second, and I think that's what's most connected to vital infrastructure, is we have to increase cyber maturity. So we all have to invest as organizations, specifically working in vital infrastructure, in a persisting and continuous cycle of increasing our cybersecurity and making sure that when our systems are hacked, we get back online fast. Third, what's necessary is we have to pay attention to hard and software, secure hard and software. We have to deploy it in a secure way, we have to develop it and design it in a secure way, and there's a lot of work to be done there. The investment in knowledge and education is a thing that we tend to forget, but we have actually a lack of good cybersecurity specialists. So we need to invest in education. But it's also about the education of our kids, using their devices on a smart and secure way. It's educating ourselves, as I did with the cryptoware case with you today. So investing in knowledge and education, very important to do. And the last one, I think, is maybe the most important thing in cyberspace, as it is different with maybe some forms of physical security. It's not something one actor can do by itself. It's not something the government can take full responsibility for. It's something we have to do together. It's something we have to do with organizations, with software and hardware developers, with consultancy firms consulting for big corporations, with the corporations themselves, with science community and security researchers. So it has to be a network of smart cooperation between all actors, getting information flowing and making sure that we get a good and secure cyber future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. That was very brief. That was good. And now we turn over to Amit from Israel, who will enlighten us on the role of the state in regulation in Israel.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Tal, for inviting me to this important conference. It's very exciting to talk to you today about Israel's cybersecurity strategy. I think the discussion is important because cybersecurity is a policy problem that many nations face, and it's also a law and technology problem, like ones dealt with in this conference in other contexts. And as lawyers, we know the details matter. So in the time that I have, I'll try to go very quickly from a bird's eye view of what Israel has done to conceptualize what is the role of the state, any state actually, in the cybersecurity domain, and then try to talk a bit about the legal implications, and at the end deal specifically with information sharing, and I hope I do all this on time. In the context of this discussion, I should mention that not everything that I'm saying here is the official view of the Israeli government, but we do believe in the discussion. So here I go. Thank you. So this is a very high-level view of the Israeli cybersecurity strategy. Basically, talking about organizational robustness, I will go into this very little, but it means that we need, first of all, the organizations and the technologies that they use to be secure. So this is echoed in other types of systems in the role of the government as regulator or creating incentives, so organizations are better protected. Cyber defense is a mission which, unlike other security domains, cannot be carried out by the government alone. So it's not a border or a law enforcement issue where you can send in troops or policemen to create the cyber defense mission. Actually, the battleground is many times the organizational network, and you need the organization in there with you to do the protection daily and when events happen. Systemic resilience deals with the issues of how fast can we come back to normal. So we have events and we have attacks, and sometimes the organizations cannot do it by themselves. Actually, this is why the state is now looking for its role here, because we see cybersecurity events everywhere. Because of breach notification, we also know about them. Large organizations, smart organizations, organizations that know how to internalize risk, and yet they're hurt time and time again by sophisticated attacks. So the government needs to do something for the systemic resilience. In this context, in Israel, we have regulation of critical infrastructures, including private critical infrastructures, since 2002. And this protection applies not by sector, but by the risk scenario. And finally, national defense, which deals with the role, the classic role, if you like, of the government as provider of public safety and national security. The government that we all opted in for from Hobbes, Levitan, right? and I probably will hear more about that sometime in this panel. And the issue of national capacity building, which I'll not go into, but it also deals with people and organizations in the cybersecurity domain. So this is a very high-level view, and what does this mean on the ground? Again, I'm doing this very, very briefly. This table wants to show the relative advantages of the government and organization in each of these procedures in cybersecurity lifecycle. So robustness, the context of the government is offline. There's a regulator issuing regulations, making sure organizations are protected. Organizations should execute this, and government incentivizes and regulates. When we talk about resilience, we talk about the online real-time role of the government. So imagine the fire brigade coming in when you have a fire, or the government assisting you, and I'll deliberate about this role in a minute. It's event-driven, so you want to solve an event or solve an attack so the organization can come back to normal, and this is a role for government. There are institutional roles for government here. There are theoretical roles for government here because of market failures. And finally, defense, which creates deterrence, national security, and law enforcement. So if we have CryptoLocker as an example, we need to have the solution very quickly to distribute among ourselves. So this is the layer 2, resilience. If we have the antidote for a cryptoware, but we still expect the government to find out who's behind that. This obviously takes some more time, and it happens after the fact. We know this issue of attribution and finding who is the cyber attacker, but there is still a lot of things that we can do to mitigate an attack even before we know who exactly is attacking us, and restore the correct functioning of the systems. So this is basically the operational philosophy. And behind it, there is an important institutional element which brings us closer to the legal element. The Israeli cybersecurity strategy talks about setting up a new national, comprehensive, across-the-board cybersecurity operational authority, not tasking this role within an existent operator. And this has two major reasons. One comes from cybersecurity policy, if you like. We believe that cybersecurity is a new type of security domain. It's sometimes like law enforcement, it's sometimes like fighting terrorism, it's sometimes like national security, but sometimes it's a whole new field and it needs new thinking. Some of it happens more today in the private sector, so we need a new cybersecurity doctrine, if you like. And the other one is a constitutional legal type of reasoning that we want to create checks and balances in this new domain, and we don't want to give too many powers or authorizations in this area to one body. So we have one body who is doing cybersecurity across the board, tapping into other organizations as necessary and according to specific rules. This is in a nutshell. And what does this mean for the legal field? Well, the state has to apply according to constitutional rules and the rule of law. So the law has a role here in defining the different roles of the state, defining the different contexts. The state as a regulator, the state as a partner, the state as an operator. And in order to do that, of course, we have to locate potential risks and mitigate them through the toolbox that we have from constitutional law, from data protection law, and in this case, data protection law is very useful because it's one of the oldest, I would say, information regulation type doctrines, ex-ante regulation of information processing. So we have content principles, we have process principles, and we have institutional design, which I just mentioned, which we believe can lead to a socially net positive outcome because remember, we need the state in this domain because we have problems in maintaining its, let's say, safety and secure functioning. So this is from a very high level view of the legal strategy. And I wanted to give the example, and this is now becoming more technical, regarding the discussions about information sharing. So one of the discussions that is talked about a lot is about the conflict between cyber threat information sharing or cyber intelligence and data protection. And I'm using STIX, which is a language, a taxonomy developed by the DHS in the US to show how sometimes the details are more important and we should look at them when we discuss this issue. So STIX basically came from the technical community to solve a communication problem. The communication problem deals with the issue of how fast can we share threat information and mitigation strategies. So basically, this is already working today in our antivirus, in our operating system. If you know, you update patches. Patches are actually messages from your vendor about bad things that the vendor has met, and now he vaccinates you against them. But this model of private type of patching is not strong enough because maybe you don't have all of the antivirus suppliers in your systems and you're missing out on some of the important information. The other thing is that threat information, because information systems are so diverse, is very diverse. So you need to bring them to a common denominator. So we have many, many types of information that we need to bring to a high level so we can share them and understand them quickly. Otherwise, it won't be relevant. Just looking at this issue shows how far away this is from any type of areas relating to data collection or data processing. Because the information that we share here is not information about what users are thinking or doing with their computers, but rather what their computers or their information systems are doing by themselves. And as you may know, most of the information on a hard drive, on a mobile phone, is completely innocent in this sense because it's talking about the things that the machine does. You know, these machines obsessively record everything that's been doing in these logs and operating systems. And this is the substance that is of interest of information security people. And when you look at STIX, you see that actually here we have an contextual language, and I'm using the word context on purpose because it allows us to see that information is built and shared for a specific purpose, which is cybersecurity, and the whole language of this information sharing is very, very many miles away from sharing of personal data in other contexts, which should be regulated according to content principles. And STIX is still in the development process, but it allows us to see the problem better. And last, I think, slide. So to conclude, this is basically the way we are moving forward. Cyberspace is composed of organizations, and the growing risks require the reemergence of the states. If we have a cyber catastrophe, probably the state will be called in, so we better think about this beforehand than after the fact. There are a lot of threat actors with a lot of motivations, and it's very easy to try because the borders are in our pockets within our smartphones. We are all connected to the borders. This is not something that the state can stand in the middle. So we need the state back in, yet we want the state back in a balanced and a proportional way which doesn't endanger the very nature of this domain, but rather promotes its security and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit. And now we'll turn to Bryan as the last speaker, presenting on the United States regulatory context. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Tal, and thanks to all of you for coming and spending an hour or so with us. I know we're facing some stiff competition next door, but at least here you get to go an hour without hearing the general data protection regulation mentioned. So a little break in your 3 days. I should also note, although I have a number of clients in critical infrastructure, I'm speaking only for myself and not for them or any part of the U.S. government. What struck me as most interesting in talking with my colleagues here earlier today and in their presentations is the next time my clients complain to me about the stiff or harsh regulatory environment in the United States around critical infrastructure, I'm just going to refer them to any of you to hear what a real regulatory environment is like. Or to put that point a little bit more seriously, a key difference between a lot of the approach, as I understand it, in Europe and in Israel and elsewhere in the United States, is in the United States, almost all of the quote-unquote regulation of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure outside a few highly regulated industries like energy sector and some parts of healthcare is almost completely voluntary. And so even the creation of the so-called critical infrastructure sectors in the United States was done, as was indicated before, by executive order, including one of the ones President Clinton issued 20 years ago, by U.S. government departments, which do not, generally speaking, carry the force of law with them. Contrast that, and I'll talk about this in a second, with the cybersecurity information sharing law, which was just passed, which, although it does carry the force of law, it still is a largely voluntary approach. And as I think Chris Hufnagel mentioned in the last panel, that doesn't mean that these things go unprotected or unenforced, because in the United States we have a very robust class action bar of lawyers who will take legal action to try to enforce cybersecurity standards. And in this instance, I think the Obama administration was very clever in the way they approached their voluntary, quote-unquote, cybersecurity standards development process, because what I predict will happen is once these voluntary standards are fully developed and promulgated, you'll start to see lawsuits in which companies are held to the standards that are in these voluntary guidances. And it's proved to be expensive for companies, but also a pretty effective way of doing regulation in the United States. And just to show you how far this voluntary concept has been pushed, and when we did the first national strategy to secure cyberspace in 2002, you might have expected a very voluntary, business-friendly approach, because the Bush administration was in power, and in the United States, Republicans and conservatives have more of a business-friendly reputation. But it's been at least as business-friendly and voluntary in the Obama administration as it was in the Bush administration. And I would say almost to the point of benign neglect. I'm a member of a private sector group in the United States with representation by the Food and Drug Administration and by DHS and others, which is designing a standard for cybersecurity for implanted medical devices. And the reason this group got together is because no government agency in the United States was doing this work. And all of the companies felt like, even though naturally they're allergic to regulation, they'd rather have some standard they can aim for than basically legal anarchy and lack of certainty. The second point I would make, and I alluded to this earlier, is that in the US context, there's a significant difference between the way the critical infrastructure sector development process and the standards for the actual protective measures have been developed, largely voluntary, and the issue of cybersecurity threat information sharing. And obviously these two are integrally related, but in the area of cybersecurity information threat sharing, we've actually had a very robust debate in Congress since at least 2012, which you might remember started with the discussion of the internet kill switch that an American president supposedly was going to have, which a little unclear how that would ever have been architected, but that long ago dropped out of the discussion. But the debate has been in every single session of Congress since. And finally, in the metaphorical dark hours of the night in December in the United States, the Congress slid the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 into the massive government funding bill that President Obama essentially had to sign or shut down the government. And so let me just turn to some of the provisions of that law, because I think they're relevant to a lot of the discussions that we've had. And that is law now in the United States. But even then, it doesn't place a lot of legal requirements on private companies. What it rather does is it creates legal space, or it's intended at least to create legal space and legal liability protection for companies sharing threat information with each other, companies sharing threat information with the government, and the government sharing threat information with companies. So it authorizes explicitly the sharing of both classified and unclassified information collected by the government with private sector companies not only in so-called critical infrastructure areas, but in any area, and requires procedures for how you take the classified information and make it available to private companies without compromising security. It requires the government to create a real-time sharing mechanism, electronic sharing mechanism with the private sector. This was very important to U.S. business. It protects businesses against the government using information provided for cybersecurity protected purposes to do unrelated enforcement actions against the companies. And it also has some privacy protections that were built into this, largely through the efforts of the Center for Democracy and Technology and a whole coalition of tech companies and interest groups, requiring that companies make reasonable efforts to remove personally identifiable information from information that's presented to the government. And in fact, it links one of the most important things to the business community with one of the most important things to the privacy and civil liberties community. And the way it does that is it provides legal liability protection. So our friends in the plaintiff's class action bar will not be able to successfully sue companies for sharing information for the government, but only if the companies have taken reasonable measures to remove the personally identifiable information. So that was, I thought, a fairly important entrepreneurial kind of innovative solution. We'll see how it works in practice. And then the last thing I'll just mention about this law is it authorizes what it calls quote-unquote defensive measures. And this is something that every one of my private sector infrastructure clients has asked about for years, and that is, what is the legal ability of us to insert code or other technology into our sensitive information that if it gets stolen and taken back, or if it's under attack, it can either go back and identify the attacker or in fact defend itself, the so-called hackback capabilities. And this has been one of the most contentious parts of the debate under this law. They sort of came out in the middle / on the weaker side in the sense that it does allow defensive measures, but it specifically prohibits a measure that destroys or renders unusable or provides unauthorized access or substantially harms another's information system. What does that include and exclude? No one has the slightest idea. There's no legislative history in Congress that's significant in defining that. The law doesn't define it anymore. It's mostly going to be, I think, a lot of work for lawyers in this area for the next few years. The one last thing I would mention, moving away from the law now, is, although it's related to the law, is this divide, and I think it's present elsewhere, but it's particularly acute in the United States, between the abilities of government agencies and the technological sophistication of them to assist the private sector in monitoring and defending their networks versus the very, very strong concern by privacy and civil liberties groups in the United States, by the Congress, and by lots of tech companies to not, quote unquote, militarize the process. So it was very important in this entire debate for the privacy and civil liberties community to minimize the role of the Department of Defense and the American intelligence agencies, in particular the National Security Agency, in working with the private sector. And of course the irony there is those parts of the government were exactly where the primary expertise and technology for cyber defense lived. So there's been this transition of a lot of these capabilities over to the Department of Homeland Security, and a significant victory for privacy and civil liberties advocates in this law that was just passed is it flatly prohibits the Department of Defense, including the NSA, from being a primary conduit for exchanging this information with the private sector. But that debate will rage on, and with that, I'll turn it over to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel for those interesting presentations. I will just very, very briefly give an overview over the German IT security law, which has been adopted last summer. And I'm doing that because actually it already anticipates the implementation of the upcoming European Network Information Security Directive, which will be adopted very soon. So in summer last year, Germany adopted a new IT security law to regulate information security practices in our country. And the law requires a range of critical infrastructure operators, which Bibi already pointed out on the slide, also, for example, media and communication, which might come as a surprise to some, to adopt a set of minimal security measures and to also conduct security audits to prove that these security measures are actually implemented in those operators. One of the most important aspects of this law is that critical infrastructure operators are required to report severe hacking or security incidents to the German IT security agency, the BSI, which sits within the Ministry of Interior in Germany. That has led to some controversy. There are specific regulations for telecoms operators and also for nuclear power companies. But more or less, these are the main points of the law. And around 2,000 companies are subject to this new law, but not all of them. A lot of the industry is actually unhappy with the law, and civil society has also mentioned some concerns. And this criticism relates to the vagueness of many of the stipulations in the law. For example, it's not clear which minimal set of security measures each of those operators have to implement. It's also not clear what state-of-the-art technology the operators have to deploy in order to secure their systems and networks. Now, that is also not very easy because the law will be implemented, or every company has 2 years now to implement these measures, and by then, a lot of the technology which is state-of-the-art now will probably be outdated. So here we really face a dilemma between technology, racing ahead and regulators trying to catch up. Maybe that's something we'll discuss later again. And another controversial aspect of this law is that all the information has to be, the incident information of severe incidents has to be reported to a government agency. And so the question is, could we have set up maybe a third party, a neutral third party that collects the information with experts that are able to treat it with expertise, but also responsibly. And again, here, going back to Bryan's point, that might raise some, concerns, at least in civil society especially, about what is done with personally identifiable data and how this might be actually transferred to other government agencies. So those are just a few, concerns about the law, just to spark the discussion a little bit as well. And I'd like to now continue with the question that I'd like to pose to the panel to get the discussion going a little bit. And we've heard about the context, the regulatory context in different countries, and as Bryan pointed out, there's a big difference between the European context, where a lot of the regulation imposes rather strict regulatory framework or mandatory requirements. In the US, a lot of these frameworks are largely voluntary and adopt a risk-based approach. So my question to the panelists is, if you could choose from the elements that we've now talked about in the different regulatory environments, what would you like to import of these elements into your own national or maybe regional legislation to create an optimal framework for cooperation between public and private partners to ensure network information security? Thank you. Who wants to start?
Well, as long as none of my clients in the United States are watching this, I would say that one of the weaknesses of the cybersecurity information sharing law that was just passed is it really has no mandatory requirements at all to share any threat information ever. And this was not a foregone conclusion. It was debated. There were dozens of versions of this law over the last few years. And what that reflects, I think, is the overlap between privacy and civil liberties concerns and security concerns. The privacy and civil liberty activists in the United States were very worried that this ostensible information sharing effort not turn into mandatory government surveillance. And I had those concerns myself, but I feel like there probably would have been a way to provide enough safeguards in the process to still make at least certain categories of severe threat mandatory reporting, and they're just not.
Well, what I think is a very important point, I think Bryan made, is the reporting duty. We have proposed a law last week, a couple of weeks, no, 2 weeks ago, to our parliament, which is a law which contains the reporting duty for companies to report all major incidents to the National Cybersecurity Center. What we see there is actually an interesting trade-off, which I heard in the speech of Bryan as well, is that what companies needed there was sort of an exemption of the Freedom of Information Act, because they were unhappy with sharing information to government and then government making it publicly. So striking a good balance between those public and private interests has been really a major concern for us in making that law, and well, it's now currently in the parliament, and it's one of the things which is looking forward to implementing the NIS directive, as that has a reporting duty as well, which I forgot to mention. The NIS directive will be signed, I hope, during our presidency, maybe before summer, and then there will be an implementation period of 21 months, and it will give every country in the European Union the obligation to have a national strategy, to have a national CERT, and to have appropriate measures in all defined critical infrastructures. Well, and that's where I think the problem starts, and that's what puzzles me as well, is what do you regulate, and what do you regulate by law, and what will be self-regulation, and how can you do some sort of an in-between, so enforcing self-regulation. Because I don't believe in setting very detailed standards in law for companies, because every company is a bit different. I think it won't be very easy to make detailed laws for in a general sense, because an industrial control system, a SCADA system, for instance, in waterworks in the Netherlands, is very different from maybe the operating room of a nuclear power plant. So how do you get detailed cybersecurity regulation in a general sense, very detailed for all the sectors, which will be the same? So I think there will be necessary to make a tailor-made approach. And it all starts and ends with the public-private dialogue, I think, because you only can make good regulation or set standards or set norms if you have if you know what you're talking about. And we, from a government perspective, can't look inside the systems of a telecom operator, of a nuclear power plant, of a transport organization, and those systems are changing on a daily basis. So it's not possible for the government to have detailed knowledge of the security and of the ICT systems. So it isn't possible for us to make detailed regulation. So we need the dialogue and the cooperation.
So I think there are two elements here. One is the regulatory issue, and in our strategy at least, most of the regulation will be done by the sector-specific regulator, which task is, in any case, to see that the sector is functioning and services are provided, and cybersecurity risks are just any other family of risks. So the central agency will give him the tools to map cybersecurity risks, but we delegate the, if you like, political economy type discussion between regulator and regulated sectors within that sector, within the whole ecosystem. In that context, I think we should differentiate between breach notifications and information sharing, and this is an important distinction I would like to make. Breach notification is basically, as I see it, a regulatory tool to make companies better protected, and it comes after the attack has succeeded because the organization knows about it. And statistics now talk about taking months to discover an attack in your system. So basically, when the organization knows that it has been breached, something bad has been going on for months. This is the statistics. When we talk about information sharing, we're talking about the whole indicators that something bad is happening in the information systems way before it contextualizes into something that you can say, I've been breached. So it's a whole different area of information sharing, and indeed, one of the difficult issues is to separate between what the government does in the cooperative manner of sharing threat indicators real time to deal with the market failure of understanding in real time what's happening in the cyber domain, and using breach notifications as some sort of regulatory measure to make companies more accountable for what they've done, and it's two different separate issues, which we also think to separate institutionally. So information sharing will be done through the CERT, basically voluntary, basically including technical information. You can see a successful, or rather successful model in the American ISACs centers, and reporting to regulators is a different ballgame, and it's part of the regulatory toolset. Thank you.
Yeah, one last point to add maybe is the international dimension, because we haven't discussed that yet in relation to this question. I would say that it's very important that we focus on obligations to do information sharing on an international level as well. And the main reason for that is that, especially in relation to critical infrastructures, when harm arises, it can have international consequences, especially for tiny countries in Europe like the Netherlands. We've placed all of our, and Belgium, we've placed all of our nuclear reactors right on the border. There's a reason for that, because it causes less harm to our own citizens and more to everybody else's. So, you know, once things start going wrong, it cascades to other countries in a literal sense. And that means that it's very important that we organize information sharing on an international level. And even if it's not about the physical harm, even informational harms can have international effects as well. We had the infamous DigiNotar hack in the Netherlands, where certificate authority was hacked, and this had consequences for internet users across the globe. So, I mean, it's vital that we organize that properly so that information gets shared as soon as possible and harm can be minimized.
Okay, thank you. One short other question before opening it up to the audience. The panel description also featured a question, will these regulatory steps that we just discussed compromise human rights and other fundamental rights? And so what is your view? Do and can regulatory steps for critical infrastructure protection compromise fundamental rights? And if so, what are examples? What can we do to protect those rights in turn?
Well, I guess I would say there's two different answers to that. One is it depends on how the authorities that governments are creating for themselves and the information they're going to collect is used. And so I would say that there's less of a risk in countries that have more vigorous oversight of their governments, but it's still going to be a risk. The other way to think about it, or one other way to think about it, is the sort of panopticon effect. So if you have a regulatory regime where essentially everything or a significant proportion of information, let's say on energy use, were automatically collected by a government, so how much heat you use, how much light you use, what appliances you use, all of those things obviously can have very serious implications for the government knowing about your personal lifestyle and sensitive information. So even if the government has good intentions and doesn't misuse that information, is it going to have an inhibiting effect on what you do in your home anyway?
Very quickly, so we talked about the privacy implications, but I want to talk about other implications very quickly. It's possible that if the government sets standards, either general or particular, it's possible that these standards will be unnecessary or will be inaccurate because of various commercial pressures. And that could affect the rights of individuals on a level that might be fundamental. They might be receiving services that are inadequate, or they might be overpaying for unnecessary security measures, and that way are harmed not in the way we usually think about as free speech or privacy, but also an economic harm across the board. And that builds into the last point I want to say, which is the way we structure this also has impacts on transparency, which is a fundamental right, as understanding how the government acts, therefore understanding and thinking about the way these regulatory measures are set in place affects rights in various capacities.
Agreed. Fully agreed.
So now finally, we want to hear from you. And yes, I already see one question. Please try to stay brief. We don't have much time. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. You've just described, it seems that there's a lot of competing interests from a lot of sector, privacy activists, government, intelligence agencies, the private sector, which the private sector has many, many different subgroups inside of that. So it's hard to see concrete steps that a majority, at least, of those stakeholders would agree to take. I'm offering you one, maybe you want to comment on it. Managing vulnerabilities. So the idea that how governments manage the vulnerabilities they discover, how they disclose them, and managing how they are either using them and keeping them secret or disclosing them. I know the US has recently disclosed part of its vulnerabilities equities process, which is essentially the mechanism they use to do that. Could that be used as a way to for governments to disclose more information on how they do this? And do you think that is having positive consequences? Is that politically feasible?
Well,
Or yeah, we'll take up one other question in combination. Anyone else? No? Ah, over there.
Well, very briefly, Tim Edgar, Brown University. My question is on sharing information, particularly threat information, and I would be interested in the panelists' views on the difference between threat information where it's technical and you're trying to get rid of the personal information, and maybe you do and maybe you don't. So that's question one. And then question two is where the purpose is actually to share the personal information, where you think that this is, information about a particular hacker or a particular person that's useful for security purposes. And we talk about sharing and then minimizing personal information, but we don't distinguish between those two different cases, which I think are, obviously very different in terms of the implications for privacy.
That's a great point. And we discussed the STIX framework a little bit earlier. My experience in doing cybersecurity investigations and sort of emergency drills is the vast majority of information that an infrastructure provider needs to combat an ongoing attack and mitigate against the attack does not need to include personally identifiable information at all. Now, what the US views as PII and what the Europeans view as PII is slightly different. So you'd have corner cases like an IP address or the search terms in a search. But generally speaking, my understanding at least is the vast majority of even the classified information that's transferred from the government to the certs and to the industry in the United States is not personally identifiable and vice versa. Now, in a particular investigation, you'll probably get to a point, if you're doing your job right, where you will need to identify a hacker, but by that time, hopefully you're far enough down the road that you've minimized the innocent information and you're only focusing on the attacker.
Well, I think I tend to agree with that. You say correctly, Bryan, that I think for instance, an IP address is in Europe a personal identifiable information. So that means that what we have to take care. I think that a good solution for that will be data hygiene. So we have to make sure that when certs get data for incident response on cybersecurity, they're not interested in which person is behind the IP address. They just want the computer to be fixed. but we need to make sure that that data is being treated sufficiently, and that the data will be deleted in certain times. So we need some oversight for that as well. So those things are, I think, being put into place at this point in time to make sure that we do the correct things, because, well, governments can be also bad, or can develop themselves into being bad, and we have to make sure we get some good divisions between the data. Talking about the vulnerabilities, I think you make an excellent point that as we face a current insecurity of hard and software, there will be vulnerabilities. And in the Netherlands, we had the vulnerability disclosure. I don't want to say regulation, but it is a form of it's sort of a manual we made for private sector and government to make sure that the vulnerabilities we all come across, that they will be publicized in a responsible way. And it has been a great success, and that's where I think all the actors come together and we make sort of a mutual agreement on all when all the interests of all the actors are balanced out, and it actually works quite well. So I think every country in Europe should have a responsible disclosure policy in place, but it's not easy, because you have all different legal systems. So there has to be some way in a legal system to make some exemption in not prosecuting the ethical hacker.
Okay, unfortunately, we need to cut off this very interesting conversation now, and I want to hand over the microphone to our chair, Tal.
So thanks, Isabel, and thank you to all the panel participants as well as the audience. I hope we're launching this conversation and continuing it in future conferences. Thank you very much.